Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the New South Wales Community of Policy Professionals webinar series. And as host of the meeting today, Louise Mamooney, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the land of Aboriginal people, wherever you may be joining us from. I'm on Gadigal land, and we have people from across New South Wales with us today, and I'd like to acknowledge elders from your area, past, present and emerging. We have, actually, I think you, Danielle, may be our first ever interstate speaker. So congratulations. We've had people from New Zealand and people from Europe speaking, and people from the Australian government, but never another state. So obviously we have definitely missed that really important connection, and all going well, we will definitely open the door for many other speakers from interstate in future. But I'd like to introduce Danielle to start with. She's the Managing Director of Good Government Advisory, based in South Australia, dedicated to helping governments do good things and do them well. Such a great phrase. And she was formerly a senior executive in the South Australian government and led major reforms on justice, education, environment, policy innovation and organisational change. She's passionate about the craft of government and people who make it work. Us, that's great. A fellow policy professional, as being the backbone of a well-run democracy. And in addition to that very fantastic work history, she is also co-host of Australia's #1 government podcast, The Westminster Tradition, where she explores integrity, leadership and what makes the public service work. And she regularly speaks to the public sector on governance and trust. She works also with ANZOG and IPA and universities and national conferences. So very pleased to have you here. I know our chair, Joanne Wilkie, is very much a fan of your podcast, and I've there's so much to explore there. So I recommend to our policy professionals when they get a chance to have a look through that. There's great material there. But Danielle, I'll hand over to you if you want to kind of introduce yourself further. I've got lots of questions for you, but we'll save those for the end. And I know you've got a fantastic presentation for us today.
Thanks so much, Louisa. Just checking that audio is all right, Louisa, before you go camera off. Is that working? Yep, beautiful. Thank you so much for having me. And while I am a South Australian, I am spending a huge amount of time working with the New South Wales government at the moment. So I'm feeling more and more a relationship with New South Wales. Danielle, as I said, Danielle Elston. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Kaurna people and recognise their continued relationship with the lands and waters on which I am on. So I will kick off. I will let you all know that I have the magical mystery, both COVID and influenza A. I didn't want to cancel on any of you. I have had to debunk to another house to protect my Year 12 student who could not have kicked me out of the house with tongs faster if she tried. So I'm also not working off of my regular tech. So I'm hoping that you will give me a little bit of latitude with any both tech failures, and also, as I said, I'm battling both COVID and flu. So apologies if it's tricky to listen to. I'm advised on the phone yesterday that my voice is not excellent. So this session isn't about failure, is about failure, but not in that kind of performative or theatrical way. I worked really hard not to use the word scandal because I think it just feeds a kind of tabloid idea about public sector success and failure. These real failures in public administration, schemes that were unlawful, programs that really harmed people, and services that fell apart slowly while everyone looked the other way. And so I just want to start by saying this. These stories aren't just painful for us to look at. They're really useful because every time we get access to a Royal Commission, an Ombudsman report, a whistleblower transcript, or a internal review, we're getting something really unusual and rare. We're getting a detailed map of how something happened. And for policy professionals, particularly people like you and me, that is absolute gold for getting better at our jobs, because the reviews don't just tell us that something failed or stuffed up. They tell us how it managed to get through cabinet like that, how the brief was written, what the timeline was, what assumptions were made, how risk was framed, what trade-offs were decided, and how that work, once it leaves our hands, actually behaved out in the world for our main customers, which are the people of New South Wales. So they show us how disconnected that policy and implementation can become and what happens when no one notices until it's too late. So I just don't think we reflect on that enough, and we do a lot of reflection and training in the hypothetical, but these kind of well-documented failures give us so much kind of information about how to do our jobs better. So we don't often see what happens once our work is translated into systems and letters and staff instructions or scripts on the phone and speeches. And the people implementing these decisions, they often don't know where the design came from, what trade-offs were made, what red flags were raised that never made it into the final version. So the point of this session isn't to kind of point fingers, it's to connect those two worlds and remind us that failure is really about bad people. It's really almost always about what gets lost in the middle. So every story I'll share today is on the public record, so they're not hypotheticals, they're just real moments, and some of them are quite shocking and some of them are quite mundane, that show how systems drift away from purpose when no one's holding them. And so as uncomfortable as it is to look at that, they help us get better. I have broken these into 10 lessons, otherwise it gets a little bit unwieldy. So the first one is that feedback loops keep us human, and I'll just tell you a bit about the UK Post Office scandal and how silence turned one error into just a systemic injustice. So just a quick kind of recap of what this one is. In 2000, the Post Office rolled out a new IT system called Horizon to 18,000 post office branches. Between 2000 and 2015, over 700 sub-postmasters were prosecuted based on that data from that computer system. From 2009 to 2012, more and more evidence internally emerges of system bugs and unexplained discrepancies. In 2013, they do an external review after pressure from postmasters, some of whom are in jail. And between 2020 and 2024, convictions are overturned and there was a public inquiry. So they roll out the point of sale system and it's developed by external companies, as is perfectly usual for all of us, ICL and then later Fujitsu. It was meant to modernise the system. It sounded excellent, allow accurate tracking of stock transactions and branch balances. And just as a note for those who don't know, the Post Office in the UK is also a little bit like our Centrelink offices. They do a lot of transaction for government, so in kind of high volume money. So instead of doing that, it triggered the worst miscarriage of justice in British legal history. From the early 2000s, sub-postmasters, who were small business operators running local post offices under franchise, although as the inquiries rolled out, it turned out they were really just employees, began to notice these kind of unexplained shortfalls in their accounts. Sometimes it was £1,000, sometimes it was £20,000. In almost every case, the sub-postmaster believed it was a system error, but Horizon didn't show any errors, it just showed losses. The Post Office had this firm policy and it was written into their contracts. If there was a loss, those of them who could find their contracts, that's another story, is that some of them had contracts with the government that had been signed 40 years earlier by their parents and they were still running it and there was no copy of it. But if there's a loss, the sub-postmaster had to make it good themselves. So they did. People borrowed money from family, they remortgaged their homes, they dipped into savings, they went to loan sharks, and when they couldn't repay it, the Post Office prosecuted them for theft. Over 700 people were criminally charged and found guilty, many for theft and fraud between 2000 and 2015. There is an amazing, someone just put in the comment, there's an amazing BBC podcast, there's also a TV show. And we did a 4-part episode on it, I think, as well. Between 2000 and 2015, dozens of them went to prison. Some of them lost their businesses and at least 4 of them took their own lives. And this system kept running year after year. And here's where the feedback loop failed and failed repeatedly. Internal logs from Fujitsu showed that the technical staff were aware of the bugs from at least 2009. The help desk logs showed patterns, including that one bug triggered identical accounting discrepancies at 14 different branches in the same month, 2 years in a row. But their suggestion was try rebooting. In court, the post office stated confidently that no one could alter transactions without the sub-postmaster's knowledge, a statement that was later proven to be false. They withheld expert reports. They denied that Horizon could be responsible. We outsource so much of our decision-making to ICT systems now, and it's very hard for both leadership and even legal systems to identify what it is that they have decided. What has the computer decided, which is the same in Robodebt. Became to unravel when, not because of the formal whistleblower system or an inquiry, but because of a campaign led by a former postmaster, Alan Bates, who refused to settle the debt, a debt he knew he didn't owe. His persistence eventually led to a forensic review, and by 2019, the High Court ruled that Horizon was in fact not remotely robust. In 2020, the first convictions were overturned, and in 2024, legislation was passed to exonerate hundreds more. In the meantime, Fujitsu employees admitted that they did have access to alter accounts remotely, something Post Office had repeatedly denied. Executives apologised. The UK government announced compensation, but no one, not a single executive, faced any kind of prosecution. So here's what failed. The system knew something was wrong, and postmasters were reporting it, IT staff were documenting it, and even some internal auditors raised doubts. But those signals didn't go anywhere. They were treated as noise, not feedback. There was no escalation pathway that worked. There was no culture of curiosity. No one was accountable for closing the loop. This lesson matters not because of the IT, but because of the mindset and the culture, the belief that once a system is deployed, it's working and it's not questionable, and that human beings raising concerns must be mistaken, that data is truth and that people are not. When feedback loops break, the system stops learning, and when systems stop learning, our policy decisions start falling over. Not my job. One of our favourite sometimes sayings in the public service, and I don't say that with ill will. Sometimes it's because you know it's not your job, and if you go meddling in other people's business, which I sometimes have a habit of doing, not everyone enjoys it if you are meddling in other people's business. So a couple of our lessons and examples here are from Robodebt, which some of you may be aware of. So it's an issue where you have two departments. The DSS is the policy department, DHS is the delivery department. In the development of the policy, the DSS legal team flags immediately that the scheme to do it would need legislative change. It's about averaging. Effectively, when you get your benefit from government, unemployment, etc., it is based on how much you earned in a fortnight. So you can earn $1,000 in one fortnight and then not be eligible for an unemployment payment and earn nothing in the following one and be eligible. What this did was take your annual ATO data and divide it by 26. So it assumed that if you earned $26,000 in a year, you earned $1,000 a fortnight, as opposed to that you might have earned that in very patchy amounts. It had a long history of being questioned. So Peter Hanks, KC, publicly states the scheme's unlawful in 2017. There is lots of advice coming backwards and forwards from different lawyers about its illegality, and eventually a secretary gets a piece of legal advice that closes it. We'll come back to Robodebt. So it was originally approved by Cabinet under the name Strengthening the Integrity of Welfare Payments to automate that process. So again, we see that automation idea and being able to question our ICT systems. It was eventually launched without that legislative change. In weeks of it being rolled out, you started to see enormous numbers of sorry, thanks for the heads up. So sorry, I got lost for a second. Because DHS and DSS operated under what the Royal Commission later called this bifurcated model of governance, DSS thought DHS would manage the legal risks, DHS thought DSS had signed off on it and no one wanted to delay, because we know that delay is the kiss of death for promotion in the public service, a cabinet-backed budget measure by saying, where this is going to need legislative change. In 2016, they kept ramping up the rollout. Debt letters were issued en masse, and I will point out the first round of letters that went out didn't even have a phone number on. The averaging method became standard practice inside both departments. The staff had doubts, but the culture didn't support any escalation. Once those concerns had reached public view and had made headlines, it became an issue of finding a way to determine that the complaints, the people going to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, the people going to them MPs were being discredited by the government without doing any integrity investigation into the system. Asked at the Royal Commission whether she had considered whether new legislation was required, the Secretary at the time, Catherine Campbell, said, "I had not turned my mind to which parts of the legislation may need to be changed." She maintained she was just not responsible for that because she was not the policy arm, and that someone would have stopped her otherwise. This was kind of despite DHS being the agency that implemented the scheme. All the staff reported to her, the compliance model, the comm strategy, the debt recovery process all sat within her department. And so the absence of interest in whether that was legal is a very concerning element of it. This failure here wasn't one bad actor. It was the result of a system where two departments could each claim the other held the pen, and where cabinet approval, there's some hilarious evidence, I mean hilarious from a government perspective, not from a victim's perspective, where minister after minister, including Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, all claim that cabinet documents are all legal. Now, anyone who has worked inside government knows that you don't get Crown advice on every piece of every document that goes to Cabinet. They actually think that the Cabinet comments circulation process, because it wafts past Attorney Generals, somehow means that everything goes to Cabinet has had legal advice against it. And it was really worrying. And I'm not talking about one minister, I'm talking about a cavalcade. Legal would throw me out of the building if I put every brief to them, 100%, right? So you have ministers who just do not know how the things underneath them are working. They are assuming that every document that's come to them has been legal. Can you imagine how we would never get anything done if that happened as well, by the way? So the Royal Commission called it the most catastrophic failure of public administration, and the ASP, the Public Service Commission, found multiple officials breached the code by failing to escalate concerns known about the illegality of the scheme. I think the simple truth of this part of Robodebt is that splitting responsibility doesn't split accountability. If a policy is unlawful, harmful, unworkable, costing more money than expected, you're in a position to act, Not My Job is not going to stand up at a Royal Commission table. You can't delegate your own integrity. And again, I'm being foiled by not my regular. One second, guys. Sorry. Again, not on my regular tech. So back to Robodebt. In early 2017, senior officials in DSS had received clear legal advice. The scheme to use that tax data. I'm sorry, I am genuinely struggling here. There we go.
It's looking good. We're on lesson 3. What happened?
Yeah, I've figured it out. Thank you, Louisa. Apologies again. It was only, this is not my normal setup. So in 2017, senior officials in DSS received clear legal advice. The scheme using the tax data to average income and raise debts was not lawful, didn't comply with the Social Security Act. The advice wasn't ambiguous. It confirmed what had been quietly raised inside the public service for 2 years, but still the program wasn't shut down. Instead, in 2017, in March, DHS prepared a submission to the Commonwealth Ombudsman, who was conducting a review of the program. that submission was signed and cleared through internal governance program and stated the program was legally sound. The Royal Commission later confirmed that wasn't true, and the DHS staff knew it. So the Ombudsman relied on the assurance and issued the report in 2017 that supported the program that ministers waved around on television and radio for years after that as evidence that there was nothing wrong with the program, because our internal governance often relies on the information we provide, not the going digging to find out whether there's anything missing. The Royal Commission found that DHS had deliberately withheld legal advice and downplayed known concern and misled an oversight body. Then in September 2019, they get a new secretary at DHS, and she had inherited a toxic program. By this point, the scheme had raised nearly $500,000 debts. Public criticism was intensifying. Internal discomfort had been building for years. And one of Leon's first acts was to request updated legal advice. And this time it came from the Solicitor General. Their opinion, delivered in early September, was that it was clear that income averaging without corroborating evidence was not a valid legal basis for raising debts. That scheme had never been lawful. What it had done is reverse the onus of proof. It had meant that what it meant was the government sent a letter saying you owe us $20,000 and now you have to prove us wrong and we won't give you access to your own records to be able to do that. So she moved to end it, but not immediately. She delayed sharing that Solicitor General's opinion with her minister, Stuart Robert, for 5 weeks. And I can understand how you would want to get your ducks in a row in that situation. You would not want to storm up with this new advice that's going to kind of catastrophically change the position of a department after 10 years. And she also informed delaying the Secretary of DSS, Catherine Campbell. In her evidence, she said that she withheld it while her department prepared a fully worked up brief to ensure the minister understood the implications and couldn't basically find a way to continue the program in a different form. She gave evidence that I formed a view that I needed to work out the implications of the advice and how to act on it before giving it to the minister. Her rationale, which I can grapple with, was if she gave the advice without a plan, she risked being ordered to continue the scheme, and she wanted a clean exit. And the advice was too important to kind of let it be buried. It was arguably a defensive strategy. It strikes me as a common way of managing things. But the APSC found that it broke their code of conduct, which I think is new information for a lot of public servants, that there is a responsibility for speed as well as for accuracy. So it later found that it breached the code in 3 areas: failure to act with honesty and integrity, failure to act with care and diligence, and failure to uphold values. Now, I recognise that's the Commonwealth, not various states, but I think it creates a different set of expectations on us as public servants than we are perhaps used to. In total, the APSC found multiple breaches of conduct, but acknowledged that Leon had acted to end the program and inherited a really, really bad culture of obfuscation and delay. She gave a media interview later that said, I did everything I could to end Robodebt. I did it at personal costs, because she was sacked after that. It was true, she was removed weeks after ending the scheme. But the lesson here isn't about blame, it's about integrity and what is actually expected of us. You don't get to wait until the conditions are perfect. You don't get to soften the blow. And even if you do the right thing and if you bend the rules, you are still the person who is accountable. So it doesn't live in your intent. Integrity doesn't live in our intent, it lives in our actions. And if you're in a leadership role, you can't actually delegate that to anyone else. Simplify doesn't mean easy. It is so commonly our problem that we think that taking 6 things and turning them into one will be easy and it will make it easier for other people. So this is a story about universal credit. In 2010, the UK government launched one of the most ambitious welfare reforms in the British history, universal credit. The vision was elegant. Instead of 6 payments, income support, housing benefit, child tax credits, and so on, recipients will get a single payment. Sounds excellent. Would taper smoothly as they earned more, which would reduce fraud and create incentives to work and simplify administration. It was one payment, one taper, one path off welfare. Sounds excellent and technically very neat, politically saleable. And in the first instance, it was a massive disaster in its delivery. At its launch, Ian Duncan Smith, then the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, insisted the implementation would be fast. And when a minister says that, mon God, that's always like a moment of terror. A digital system would allow for near real-time income tracking, and they, of course, hired their IT team and timelines were set and legislation was passed. Within a year, the cracks started to show. So by 2012, internal reports warned that the system design was unworkable. The IT platform was so poorly built, it couldn't process claims. And they introduced a workaround called the twin track system, where a live service would run separately from the real one just to keep up appearances. The audit office later said that the department had spent over £400 million on an IT system that had to be written off. And here's an excellent bit of policy. They kept one tiny part of it working forever so they didn't have to write it off and demonstrate their own failure. And the chair of Public Accounts Committee described the rollout as an extraordinary catalogue of poor oversight and bad decision making. Inside the department, officials were concerned about risk, but they focused overwhelmingly on the delivery risk, technical failures, reputational fallout, and costs. Other risks were deprioritised, like human risk, people falling into rent arrears, waiting 5 weeks for their payments, operational risk, staff working across 2 or 3 incompatible systems, and ethical risk, pushing a scheme before it could barely function. By 2014, Duncan Smith was under pressure and he insisted the vision was still sound. And the vision, of course, is different to the implementation. The vision was sound. And he blamed civil servants and external contractors for delays. Here's a public servant, here's a fast-moving bus. Underneath, off you go. And in March 2016, he resigned. His resignation letter stated, "I'm simply unable to watch passively while policies are enacted in the name of fairness when it's simply not true." He had pushed through a policy he believed in, but found himself unable to defend the real impacts of its delivery. Even after his departure, problems continued. Housing associations reported increased arrears, claimants were sanctioned for missing appointments they didn't know they had, vulnerable weeks went weak, people spent weeks without incomes. And yet he was knighted. Emergency payments had to be introduced. The central flaw here, it wasn't the idea, right? So the idea is excellent. The policy is great. It's the assumption that simplification is in fact simple to deliver. Policy simplification only works if the real world system has the capacity, technology and staffing and time to support it. Universal credit was launched on a timeline that never matched the technical readiness or operational maturity of the system. As one of the staff put it anonymously in a submission to the Public Accounts Committee, we were told to get on with it. We hadn't even finished designing the form. It's hard to improve if you are stuck in strategic limbo. This is about Oakden. Oakden was an aged care facility for older people with complex mental health needs. Typically older men with dementia and significant behavioural disturbances. It was a government-run, chronically underfunded and tucked away in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. Again, one of the reasons it was set up was because if you don't have an aged care facility you can access and the private sector wouldn't meet this particular demographic of need because it was a really tough one, you had bed blocking in hospitals. So the logical idea was to create your own service. By the early 2000s, it was already seen as a service that the state government wasn't good at delivering at. In 2003, SA Health began to explore options for outsourcing, but didn't progress it. In 2007, the facility narrowly avoided losing its aged care accreditation because they were under a health system. They were running under health accreditation as well as aged care accreditation, which kind of gave you an opportunity to slip right between the cracks of both. All the staff were seconded in because it was a place no one wanted to work. Repairs were made just to meet accreditation narrowly, and a partnership was formed with a non-gov provider. But once they got their accreditation resecured, the sense of urgency faded and the plan to outsource was put back on ice. In 2008, the Stepping Up Mental Health Strategy was released, and it contained this recommendation which vaguely suggested a clear plan of action for long-term residential aged mental health care and emphasised partnerships with the Commonwealth and aged care providers. A former CE of SA Health told ICAC later that the language was intentionally vague to avoid a fight with the unions. Over the next decade, at least 3 formal business cases were prepared to transfer Oakden to a non-gov provider in 2012, 13, in 2015, and again in 2016. Each time they stalled because they didn't really know how they would do it. So they're operating in that world, and I think most of us have actually been here, that world where you might be being about to be mobbed, or your program might not make it through the next budget. And you are living in this world of limbo, effectively, trying to kind of move your way forward. Ministers were briefed, minutes were sent, but no one made the decision. Some wanted to avoid conflict with the unions, others didn't believe in outsourcing, and crucially, no one viewed Oakden as a crisis service, just a chronically poor one. And that indecision had those consequences. It never received any capital investment, chairs were broken, furniture was soiled, staff operated under minimum enterprise agreement ratios despite having the most complex patients in the state. A junior staff member requesting a blood pressure cuff retailing at around $30 was denied. They were told to borrow one from another ward. When they persisted, they were bullied by a manager, roster changes without consultation. It wasn't a one-off, that was the culture of the place. When the chief psychiatrist review found that staff repeated 2 key mantras: there's no money for Oakden, so don't bother asking for anything. Oakden will be soon taken over and managed by an NGO provider. We're just trying to survive until then. No one owned the future, so no one invested. And a staff member told the reviewer, management told us, stop asking for things you're not going to get. ICAC ultimately made 6 findings of maladministration. 4 were against operational managers at the site. 1 was against the customer liaison officer. The 6th was against the actual local health network itself. The Commissioner considered whether to make findings against the CEO of SA Health and the CE of NALHN, so the local health network, and the relevant ministers. He didn't in the end, finding that while they were responsible, they weren't given enough information to put them on notice. For the Director of Older Persons Mental Health, he noted that she had submitted multiple business cases and consistently been told to make savings. He concluded that she was frustrated as a consequence of budget restraints, and I think she just gave up, which I can understand. But in the end, that resignation, the quiet giving up, contributed to a facility where older South Australians were over-medicated, restrained, abused and neglected. The building was wrong, the model of care was wrong, but the most corrosive thing was the limbo. Oakden was existing in a permanent state of soon to be axed, soon to be outsourced, soon to be someone else's problem, until of course it wasn't. If we stick with Oakden, when the chief psychiatrist, so the lesson here is secrecy thrives in those power imbalances. When the chief psychiatrist was released in 2017, one quote from the report shocked even the most hardened practitioners in these areas. This is amongst the most abhorrent approaches to providing care, and any of the review had encountered in well over 110 years of collective practice. It simply lacks any humanity. They were referring to a practice called floor time. Staff would leave residents on the floor, sometimes for extended periods, if they judged the intervention wasn't immediately required. The justification for this was written euphemistically in clinical notes as things like tends to lie on the floor. When the review asked about it, the staff confirmed it was a regular part of their interaction with certain patients. It's just kind of one example of how abuse wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was kind of happening in plain sight, sustained by toxic culture, siloed management and power imbalances at every level. Families were the first to be silenced. The review and ICAC both found that families who tried to raise concerns were treated as troublemakers. And I, will say that I have spent a lot of my time as a carer for various people, and you are very well aware that you need to be supplicant to power sometimes in the health system in order to make sure that your person gets what they need. Several feared that their loved ones would face retaliation. One family whose relative had unexplained bruising were brushed off. It was only when their loved one died and they kept pushing that anything shifted. They lodged a complaint. It got lost in the system. They escalated, they called again. Eventually, they found a community visitor, like a statutory advocate, who was willing to help them keep pushing. That one relationship was critical for that power imbalance. It gave the family legitimacy, the right language, and access. Even then, of course, the bureaucracy dragged its feet. By 2016, a draft letter had been prepared by the acting director to respond to the complaint, but the acting director refused to sign it. I believe this letter contains serious allegations, and I'm not sure the response recognises it. Further, I am not sure it is appropriate for me to sign off. I think there are some concerns with regard to the abuse and use of restraints. That could have been the moment. And in all of these scandals, you find there's always many, many moments where something should have changed. Within Oakden, the culture was designed by sorting things out on the floor. Sometimes this can become a point of pride for departments. You know, we don't escalate, we figure it out ourselves, we're problem solvers. The very senior managers didn't visit the wards, they just worked out in offices in a separate wing of the facility. The clinical director on site one day a fortnight. These things are all done in manuals and models of care and policy. Staff were discouraged from making external reports despite mandatory reporting requirements under the law. Internal incident reports were handled in-house with a clear message, raise concerns and be pushed back. The chief psychiatrist noted, and you will find in all the scandals that you have higher than usual levels of labour hire. So agency staff and international recruits was the kind of bedrock of the staffing policy and at Oakden. And so these are people who have a limited posting. They can be let go without any, they can be not given any more shifts. So that limited their confidence to question the things that they were seeing. The complaints process actively failed in this situation, and that's where the secrecy kicks in. So from the ICAC report about the customer liaison office, yeah, the agency staff are also in limbo. I completely agree, Jocelyn. So this is in relation to the complaints officer. Mr. Mutakis discharged his responsibility by simply accepting information and explanations given to him by staff and passing them on to the complainant. He seemed to be of the opinion that complaints and reports should be fielded rather than investigated, and that fielded rather than investigating has been stuck in my head since we did this piece of work. The broader clinical governance structure failed. There was no learning culture, only a compliance culture. The primary concern was satisfying aged care accreditation standards, not improving care. It could have stayed hidden, but it didn't. In 2016, the CE of the local health network met with the complainant who had the statutory advocate and whose husband had died after suffering injuries. 5 days later, the CE formally requested the review by the chief psychiatrist. She'd sensed in the meeting that the system's usual responses weren't enough. And once the chief psychiatrist went in, it unravelled really quickly. Within months, the facility was shuttered, and then the Royal Commission into Aged Care was announced, and Oakden became the starting point for a reckoning across the whole sector. But these things still seem to be having a kind of luck or unlucky approach to them. You'll know, I'm not covering Vivian's salon, but Amanda Vanstone often comments that the husband of a woman who was deported, an Australian citizen who was deported, just accidentally got onto her chief of staff after being dismissed by the department. And she reflects that if that hadn't happened, that particular scandal would have gone on for a lot longer as well. So sometimes there can be a little bit too much luck involved where our complaints systems are really about just batting complaints away, not having a look at them. This one, I think, for policy professionals, what looks good on paper can just fail in real life. Sometimes we design for government instead of the people we serve. So at the heart of Robodebt was just a simple idea: compare ATO records to Centrelink reporting. If income looked different, raise a debt and leave it to the recipient to disprove. As we get more and more access to data and data matching and algorithms, there is an increased view of what we can do with it in relation to compliance. But the simplicity only worked if the people understood the maths. So the averaging logic assumed that income was earned evenly across fortnights, and many people don't work that way. Casual workers, shift workers, students, gig economy, contractors. The policy designers either didn't know that or didn't stop to think that it mattered. Either way, that's a problem. The letters sent to welfare recipients said they owed money. They didn't explain how the debt was calculated or invite any conversation. It didn't even include a phone number. Instead, they were deliberately designed to push people online. These design choices weren't accidents. They came from the behavioural insights team led by Jason McNamara, who testified at the Royal Commission. His team tested letter prototypes aiming to nudge recipients to engage with the system on their own. And here's what the user testing found. 2 of the 40 participants could understand the letter they read. Only 2 grasped that government was proposing to average their annual income to calculate fortnightly debts. Now, sometimes the audio, this is one of my favourite videos, can be challenging. Let me just check if there's a setting. Oh, I'll hit play on it. And if you can't hear it, Louise, maybe give me a wave and I'll see if there's a problem. Okay, so that is often a problem with the volume and you have to turn your volume up. What I will do is circulate the link. I think I can gather from the chat that a number of people could hear it and a number of people couldn't. So I will make sure that the deck is circulated and the link's in it. I will give you the summary version. He's asked, wasn't it a bit of a worry that no one could understand the letters that proposed a debt? So if you get a debt letter for $2,000, let alone $20,000 or $30,000, and you live off $335 a week, it is the equivalent for some mid and ranking senior public servants of out of the blue receiving a debt of nearly $1 million. It was an enormous amount of money to people. I'm sorry, Jocelyn, I'm not known even when I'm sick for being quiet. So everyone turned their volume up and was then copped my loud voice. Apologies. What he says is, look, it's a bugger. We sent these letters out, but effectively what he says is schools are not teaching people things, and they were all too dumb to understand my excellent letter. That's a degree of contempt for your citizens that is just extraordinary. So actually, I've got the quote, so I can give it to those of you who couldn't hear it. And I said we will send out the I'll send out the link in the deck. But when he's asked about the fundamental problem with the scheme and the letters, he says, "It told me there's a fundamental problem with the Australian education system where people can't understand averaging. That's pretty appalling, but that's where we're at as a society. And then he says, we sort of had to explain averaging first and then the application of averaging. That was pretty difficult for us to do." The framing is just really striking. Like, the failure isn't the letter or the policy. The failure, in his view, is the people. And I think that if we're really honest, sometimes we do have moments of, oh God, people don't get us, they don't understand our complexity, etc., etc. In another moment of complete disconnection, and that video is even worse, which is why I don't even bother, former Minister Alan Tudge tells the Royal Commission that most people earn the same amount every fortnight, and that so that income averaging seemed like a pretty reasonable thing. And Commissioner Holmes interrupts and says, well, maybe public servants do, but a whole lot of other people don't. It was a single sentence that really cut through the entire kind of logic of the policy. The scheme had been designed for people with a steady income, full broadband access, strong literacy, people whose lives were very regular. And it was not designed for the people who are often using our welfare system, whose lives are not as regular as that. Recipients receive letters they couldn't understand, representing legislation they'd never heard of, demanding payments that they couldn't in a pink fit forever ever afford, with no way to speak to a human. When they called Centrelink, obviously they were sent to the online portal. The system assumed that the confusion was the recipient's fault. And that wasn't just Robodebt. The same dynamic played out in Universal Credit in the UK, where people were forced to wait 5 weeks for their first payment because monthly income assignment made sense to policy designers. It didn't make sense to people who needed to buy food. It played out at Oakden, where staff and families raised complaints for years, only to be told they didn't understand the model of care. In each kind of case, government designed for itself, not the people using the system. When behaviour insights were introduced, they had a promise. Nudge theory, drawn from, the airport book of Nudge, was meant to make things easier and less bureaucratic, text reminders and that kind of thing. But in Robodebt, we used it for ill, not for positive things. It was used for compliance. The letter was tested and people didn't get it. And the decision was that there was something wrong with the people, not something wrong with the system. Good policy isn't just about being clever. It's about being usable. You need a stop button. So by 2016 with Robodebt, the scheme had become routine, discrepancies identified by a computer system, debts were calculated using ATO data, letters sent automatically, impersonally and relentlessly. Most Centrelink recipients receiving these letters had no idea what they meant. Some thought they were fraud notices, others panicked. In many cases, people who knew they had done nothing wrong paid the debts anyway just to make it all stop. The key issue here is the process ran without any meaningful human intervention. There was no trigger point that required someone to review a debt before it was issued or after it was issued. There's no discretion embedded in the system, no obligation to slow things down. If too many complaints came in, no one watching for patterns of harm. And in 2016, that harm was very visible. Lots of media stories, internal complaints, staff raising concerns about the distress and suicide risk to recipients, legal doubts raised repeatedly for more than a year. And within the Department of Human Services, one senior staff member paused the sending of new letters over Christmas. They didn't acknowledge that at the time, but the Royal Commission later found that it had happened, likely as a result of increasing concern and holiday season sensitivity, but it was a very quiet pause. It slowed things down and then it resumed again. So they knew there was something wrong, but they didn't know how to hit the stop button. There was no review, no policy change, just a suspension in the hope that that would take the heat out of it. This was the closest the scheme over that 10 years came to stopping. but the rest of the system didn't have such a switch. The Secretary didn't intervene. The Royal Commission found that no one felt they had the authority and the obligation to stop it. Some were really unsure of their role, others feared political fallout, and someone assumed that someone else was taking care of it. Policy systems, especially automated ones, need to be designed with this in mind. Someone needs to have a way of hitting the stop button. So again, it's not just about Robodebt. Every new generation of digital transformation, real-time compliance, AI-powered assessments come with the same risk. We design for scale and speed and precision, but we forget to design for doubt. What if we're wrong? What if no one understands the letter? What if, even though we are certain, the model is flawed? At Robodebt, someone paused the letters. That was something, but it wasn't a system setting. It was a panicked human kind of workaround, a quiet expression of discomfort that the process had become inhumane. So the lesson for this one is this: if you can't pause the program, you can't trust it. You need to build in a human stop button. Inquiries don't fix things. They create great podcast material, but they don't fix things unless you ask the right question. So in 2013, the Post Office in the UK is under growing pressure. For over a decade, it's been prosecuting sub-postmasters for theft and fraud, hundreds of them, based on entirely on evidence from a computer system. You know, I'm Gen X because I call it a computer system. Postmasters were speaking up, though. Some had been keeping detailed logs, others had campaign support, there were whispers in Parliament. This was starting to get some legs. So they commissioned a review led by Second Sight, an independent forensic accounting firm. Their mandate was to examine individual cases and assess where the system had failed. What happened next was really revealing. They started to ask actual questions and identified unexplained discrepancies, flagging sub-postmasters were being blamed for faults they could have no control over, and criticised the Post Office for failing to disclose evidence. Post Office did not like what they heard, so they got a second review. This time by a KC, including Jonathan Swift. Their brief was narrower. It was to assess whether prosecutions had been properly conducted and whether Horizon was broadly reliable. And here's the kind of key detail. The Swift review did not review any legal advice provided to Post Office during prosecutions. It did not interview any sub-postmasters whose lives had been upended. It focused almost entirely on internal documentation and procedural questions. It concluded there's nothing to suggest the Post Office has prosecuted cases when it ought not have prosecuted. This statement was based on a deliberately really limited scope, and it was used, a bit like the Ombudsman in Robodebt, by the Post Office and Fujitsu to reassure Parliament, the media and the public that there was nothing to see here. The review didn't uncover any new evidence. It didn't speak to people who had been jailed. It didn't explore how prosecutors withheld key information. It wasn't an investigation, it was kind of insulation, and this is the risk of internal reviews. When we feel under pressure, the instinct is to call for a review. Sometimes that's very sincere, but sometimes it can be performative. And what matters most is the TOR. Who's setting the questions? Who's choosing the reviewers? What is success here? In the case of Post Office, this review became part of the harm in the same way that the Ombudsman review became part of the harm in Robodebt. Not all reviews are created equal. In aged care reviews, so we've seen it across the rest of them, in aged care reviews focus on compliance rates, not lived experience. Robodebt external reviews excluded frontline staff and excluded legal advice. In Oakden, where internal culture reviews failed to surface the power dynamics. Reviews can be excellent, but only if they're designed to be great, and only if given access to go and find the information themselves, not rely on the public servants to provide it. Because our internal documentation is often very good. How that can translate in real life can often be really tricky. No one really thinks they're a villain. In every single situation, we have an issue of systems breaking down, and no one thinks they're a villain because the harm came from drift, not malintent. Late in the Robodebt Royal Commission hearings, a former minister was asked about his role and what he knew, and when he knew it, and why the scheme had continued for so long. And he replied with something quite familiar. He says, it's usually a cock-up, not a conspiracy. A nice deflection. But Commissioner Holmes comes back and says, but what about a conspiracy to cover up a cock-up? It landed like a hammer because in that essence is what Robodebt had become. It started as a bungled scheme, a budget line, a data match. Advice was withheld over time. Ombudsman submissions were misleading over time. Legal risk was downplayed. People weren't conspiring to hurt the vulnerable necessarily. They were conspiring to protect themselves. And that's the really uncomfortable truth you find if you spend a fair bit of time in these reports. The people aren't villains, they're professionals, they're public servants, they're like you and I. We saw this in the Essendon supplement scandal. The governance review of the Essendon Football Club, led by Ziggy Sukowski, found that the high-performance staff were operating in their own system. Sideline doctors, no policies. His conclusion was simple. It was good people in a really bad system. There's no evil genius, no moustache-twirling villain injecting a teenager with experimental substances. There was just this kind of momentum, a desire to win, an unclear structure, and too few people asking hard questions. We saw it again in Oakden, where most staff didn't set out to harm patients. They were working in an underfunded, unsupported facility with no clear model of care. Inadequate oversight, the culture on the floor, the normalisation of restraint, the silence and indifference to suffering created a place where harm became routine. By the time it was exposed, no one at the top could explain how it had lasted so long because they'd stopped looking. And we see it in how Robodebt ended. Renee Leon took over in 2019 and shut the scheme down. But she still was a part of the slowness of that, and she delayed telling the minister. She made line ball calls that the APSC found were not the right ones. She was part of the solution and yet still part of the harm, because most people don't think they're doing the wrong thing. They think they're managing risk. They think they're following process and buying time. But by the time the damage is visible, the people who might have stopped it are buried under layers of defensiveness and busyness and belief in the systems we work under. So what is that last lesson? It's that it's not enough to say that we're good guys, that we mean well, that we never do harm, because harm doesn't actually require intent. Most of the time it just requires inertia. And the line between error and negligence and drift and denial, and between defending a program and defending yourself, is a lot thinner than we'd like to admit. Commissioner Holmes wasn't being clever when she said, what about a conspiracy to cover up a cock-up? She was being quite clear-eyed. And if we want to do better, we're probably going to have to be more clear-eyed ourselves. That went on slightly longer than I meant it to, Louisa, but then I didn't know how I could pull up stumps without the end of the story. So I am happy to take questions for as long as people have, but I recognise that they probably are running off, so it's completely up to you.
We will see if there's time. We do have time for probably 2 quick questions. If you have questions, can you please write them in the chat so I will know to turn to you? I know a few people put their hands up, so can you write your question in the chat very quickly? And I wanted to thank Danielle for such a fabulous. I didn't really want to interrupt because it was amazing, and I think
I could see the time. I was still kind of going,
So. And I think people were just gripped with the stories and also horrified to turn that mirror on themselves as well. I know I was definitely thinking that along the way. So it's been brilliant. I can't see any immediate questions, but I did want to ask you, particularly as you're not from New South Wales, although you're becoming very familiar with us, if what do you think New South Wales could do better? We all kind of think, oh, this wouldn't happen here. But how do we take those blinkers off?
Yeah, I think we all think that. Although, as I said, when you're watching it up close, like I remember all the evidence about them leaving a meeting thinking like they left without that, where one department thought this and the legal thought that. I've been in those meetings 1,000 times before. Where I thought we'd agreed you were paying for it, you thought we were paying for it, and we all left the meeting, and then we had to kind of round back later. I think some of the things we can do is a bit better documentation. I think we have become a little bit FOI shy. I don't think you have to throw government under the bus and reveal everything in order to take some better meeting notes and kind of do a bit more in that space. I think if you look at things, so one of the ones someone said, what about what worked? Universal Credit has a different end where they actually get it back together and it works really well. And one of that was they were very, very clear on purpose and multidisciplinary teams. So we end up in lots of trouble when our policy is disconnected from our ICT team or our HR, etc. So I think we can do better if we work across disciplines a little bit more often. So there's a few different things we can do to predict it. I think these things can happen to us much more easily than we think. When you look at the people in these things, they were actually mainly trying to do their jobs, but they'd been told there was no more money, or they had been told that the minister wanted it opened by Friday. I think these are things we can all feel.
Or it wasn't their role.
Wasn't their job. I mean, these are things that
yeah.
I find pretty familiar, you know, like.
Yeah. All right.
I think that, absolutely.
Our chat has exploded with lots of commentary, which is fantastic. So I think we have had a good discussion, at least in the chat as well. So thank you very much for everyone participating and sending links in. It's really fantastic to engage with you all that way. We will wrap up. I wanted to thank Danielle for coming on and talking to us. Was there anything else you wanted to say, Danielle, before I close out?
I was going to say there's some awesome things in this chat, and if anyone wants to jump on LinkedIn, I'm always happy to talk public sector practice. So, we can continue this in any other way you want. Go for it.
Great, thank you. Just to close, thank you, Danielle. Thank you for our audience in your interest and enthusiasm in policy. And a quick plug for our webinar next month. We're going to do brilliant briefing notes. If you have juniors or people who are new to writing in the public service, then I'm going to be delivering a webinar on how to write a really great briefing note, or at least my experience in doing that. So please let people know about that. Haven't settled on a date, but you'll get a notice on it shortly. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Particularly
everyone.